George Washington Carver was born a slave. He experienced the hardships of life under the system of slavery and discrimination. Yet, he rose above it all and is considered one of the best scientists in history. He discovered and invented a numerous amount of things that have helped to advance the world in agriculture and other areas that we still go by and use today. George Washington Carver was born in Diamond Grove, Missouri on January 1st in 1864 as a slave during the Civil War. His mother's name was Mary. He had an older brother named James and 3 sisters. He, his mother, and siblings lived in a log cabin on a farm. They were slaves to a nice couple named Moses and Susan Carver. The Carvers were very much against slavery, but desperately needed help to take care of their huge 240-acre farm. So they treated Mary and her children very well, basically like family. The Civil War was a conflict between the North and South, where they fought about slavery. The North were non-slave owners who were fighting for the rights and freedom of slaves. The South were fighting to keep their slaves. During the war, the top half of Missouri was being governed by the Northern Union, and the bottom half, where George and his family lived, was being governed by the Southern Confederacy. Even though Moses Carver owned slaves, he was hoping the Union would win the war so that slaves could be free, independent people. There were often thieves going around, stealing slaves and selling them for money. So Moses Carver feared for Mary and her children's safety on a nightly basis. Luckily, he had a backup plan if this were ever to happen to Mary. He had a secret hideout where he would put her, just in case he felt that thieves were coming. But one night, something terrible happened. Moses' plan had failed. Mary and one of her daughters were being kidnapped by thieves. Moses ran over to their cabin where he heard the horses coming, but he was too late. While being taken, Mary quickly scooped George up in her arms so she wouldn't have to leave him alone. He was sick and she didn't want him to die in the cold. The thieves took them away. As soon as Moses Carver woke up the next morning, he contacted a man to go and find Mary and her children. Moses promised the man that if he found them, he would pay him by granting him his finest racehorse that was worth $300. Some days later, the man returned and told Moses that he couldn't find Mary and her daughter, but he did find the little baby. Moses was heartbroken when he found out about what had happened to Mary, but was happy that at least George was okay. He gave the man the horse. From there, Moses and Susan took George and James and cared for them, just as they were their own children. George was sick and frail as a child. At a very young age, he got a disease called whooping cough. It damaged his voice box, which caused him to have a very high-pitched tone to it for the rest of his life. He could not work in the fields. Susan taught him how to cook, read, write, mend, embroider, do laundry, garden, and make herbal medicines at home. George discovered his interest for plants and nature by Susan's teaching and by going outside very often to observe plants. He began experimenting with natural pesticides, fungicides, and soil conditioners. Soon, George became known as the plant doctor around his neighborhood because of his natural ability to determine how to improve their gardens, fields, and orchards. The Civil War finally ended in 1865, and the North won, just as Moses Carver wanted. Moses happily told George and James that they were now free, and that they could leave if they wanted to. Yet, they desired to stay because they loved the Carvers and they were the only family that they knew. They even called them Uncle Moses and Aunt Susan. When George was 11 years old, he and his brother James decided that they wanted to go to school now that they were able. The nearest school that would accept African Americans was 9 miles away from the Carvers' home. The school was called the Lincoln School for African American Children in a town called Neosho. The brothers walked there every single day, to and fro. After attending for a short period of time, though, James decided to drop out of school and become a house painter. He felt like he was wasting his time. George, however, wanted to stay in school. He attended until he was 17 years old. After finishing primary and middle school, George moved to Minneapolis, Kansas, by himself to take high school. He finally graduated in his mid-20s. In the meantime, he developed a liking for painting. He he taught himself to paint and created lots of illustrations. One of his more popular works is the Yucca Gloriosa painting, which later won him a first prize at the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893. How he began inventing and his many discoveries. Soon after graduating high school, George already knew that he wanted to go to college. So in 1880, he moved to Iowa and applied to Iowa State College of Agricultural and Mechanical Arts. At first, he was accepted into the all-white college, but later rejected when the administration learned that he was African American. But he didn't let that stop him. A couple months later, he applied to Simpson College in Indianola, Iowa, and he got accepted. He was the second African American to be admitted. Tuition amounted to $12 a year, but even that amount was hard to come by. George worked as a cook at a hotel in Winterset, Iowa to raise the money. 3 years later, he applied to Iowa State again and was accepted. They saw how smart he was, so they decided to give him a shot. They put him in charge of the greenhouse of the horticultural department at the college, while also doing regular college work. The staff and students there immediately picked up on his amazing attitude and his smarts. He gained lots of respect from everyone there. Later on, he earned his master's degree in the field of agriculture in 1896 and had become an expert at mycology, which is the study of fungi, and plant cross-fertilization by the time he was done. A career begins. In 1869, George received a letter in the mail from Booker T. Washington of Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. He was asking him to come and teach at his school, and to help the poor, uneducated community learn to care for themselves agriculturally. In the letter, Booker said that George would have very little resources and would have to make use with what he had, since the school was very new and low on funds. George knew that he could do it, so he accepted the challenge. 3 months later, he arrived at the school in Alabama. Booker offered him 2 rooms on campus and a pretty large salary. Most people that worked there had 1 room and had to share it with a roommate. Booker saw that George had unusual potential and needed a lot of extra space to teach. He helped the school tremendously by developing the agricultural department. He taught the African American community there how to plant cash crops correctly, and more specifically showed them that they had been wearing out the soil by excessively planting cotton. George worked at Tuskegee Institute for more than 40 years and became very close friends with Booker T. Washington and his students. After George worked with Booker for a while, he decided to adopt Booker's last name, Washington, as his middle name. He liked the sound of it and kept it. As he taught, over the years he gained national and even international fame. Everyone started to recognize him for his amazing talent. Even the President of the United States of America, Theodore Roosevelt, often looked to him for advice on agricultural needs. Eventually, George created a mobile classroom where he would go around to farmers' homes and teach them all about the correct ways in agriculture. It was known as the Jessup Wagon. Lasting legacy. Sadly, George Washington Carver died on January 5, 1943, at the age of 78 after falling down the stairs at his home. He was buried next to Booker T. Washington on the Tuskegee grounds. Overall, George Washington Carver created about 60 products from the pecan, 100 from the sweet potato, and 300 from the peanut. He published all of his discoveries in a series of about 50 bulletins. He wrote a total of 7 books in his lifetime, all of which talk and teach about agriculture and cooking. From this day on, everyone will remember him as an amazing person, a brilliant scientist, and most importantly, a pioneer for the African American community.